I'm thinking of someone who, let's say, they're tracking a little bit here, but they feel like experientially they'll say something. It's like just a man that's trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body. How do these categories, what you're arguing here, help someone who's struggling with that just experientially, but also open to kind of wrestling theologically with what's happening here?
I think one thing at this point, when you get into the individual experience of someone who, in their own mind and their own understanding, their experience isn't resonating with these truths, then what I would say in that situation is I'm trying to help someone see the truth. Maybe it's a pastoral counseling situation or just a friend whom I love, family member, whatever it is. At that point, what I want to do is say, look, the one who made us is the one who tells us what we are, tells us who we are. And you will be the happiest and most flourishing version of yourself when you believe what he tells you and you order your life according to that. So what I'm going to try and help them do is see that what they're feeling, though it may be a genuine experience, it's an experience of lies that they're being tempted to believe. And so in compassion, I want to say, look, you're coming under temptation to believe lies. And so at this point, I'm not necessarily trying to convince them of the essence existence distinction. I'm just trying to convince them of the fact that it's God who says that he made them male and female. As Psalm 100 verse 3 says, it is he who made us and not we ourselves. We don't get to form our own ontology. We don't get to trade ontology for identity and then just frame our own identity either. We are those who are made by God, and thus we believe what God says about how he's made us. And this is the pathway to flourishing. And so your path to happiness, I'm going to say to this person, is not figuring out which gender you are. Your path to happiness is believing that the obvious gender, the one that is the sign of which is given to you in your biological reality, right? Believing that that's true. And then, you have a whole theology of the fall, right? I mean, how can people be confused about something so obvious? Well, because our minds are darkened.
Yeah.
We're fallen and sinful. And so there's all kinds of irrational things we can believe. And our affections are also caught up in the fallenness and corruption of this. And so there's all kinds of things we can feel that are false. And so we look to God and we just say, we want to believe what God says and resist that temptation to do otherwise. So a lot of the work we're doing in the two essays that Michael and I have produced on this topic is in many ways, it's upstream from that pastoral moment. It's
Yeah.
upstream from that conversation where you're trying to point someone to God, his glory, the gospel, redemption, the pathway to flourishing that's in Christ alone. We're way upstream from that in the ideological battleground that's helping ground this counsel we would give, helping ground it against subtle and sometimes sophisticated arguments to the contrary.
Yeah, that was a really good answer. And what I would add to that is not only do we see this as like this is not something you start in the first counseling conversation. You're like, well, let me tell you about the essence and existence of things. Let's go back to Thomas. That's not where most people are at, and we're not saying that's the pastoral way to go. But not only is it upstream as something you probably want to eventually somehow get to, even if you're not using these categories with someone, you need to have these kind of things on the front end so that you don't give into what is commonly called right now, because of Joe Rigney and other guys' work, of toxic empathy. In other words, when someone comes to you struggling, you need to have a steel spine and actually stand behind God's good design so that you don't simply give into the distortion of someone else. Augustine and Bavinck have done really good work on this newish translated work of on psychology. It came out, I think, last year. I can't remember the exact title. But in that work, he advocates for Augustine's view of hating sin, loving the sinner. And the way he does that, though, is not the cliche way we often see in our day, which is almost affirming sin.
Yeah.
Rather, what both of them say is the way that you love a sinner is by understanding who they were made to be. You need to have a doctrine of creation that's right, because then you know the inherent dignity and you can actually pity the disfiguration that sin has caused. You can weep with what it's doing while also not allowing the emotions of that to reconform you so that you start moving the standard of what God's design is into so that it starts conforming to sin. And so having this on the front end is vital for you as a counselor so that you're able to actually love this person as God has designed while also helping move them in a way where they can move towards flourishing. As an adage I've heard before in the context of the church says, that it's okay to not be okay, it's just not okay to stay that way, right? And that really has to be our framework here. We're telling people, okay, you're there, that's where you're at. Let's actually move towards where you can flourish. And that flourishing doesn't happen by living by your standard or by giving into every feeling you may have, but actually live in accord with what God has revealed and what he has said.
If that moment of Christian care and love and a desire to help direct someone according to God's path, if that moment is where we're drinking from the stream, well, the purity of the water and the health of the water is affected by what's flowing from upstream. So we need that to be fixed. And if you don't have a clear understanding that to be human cannot be understood apart from gender, then you're not in a position to help anybody who's struggling with gender issues. Like, you gotta, to Michael's point, you gotta have those things fixed. Our teachers, our pastors, our counselors, just good solid Christians who are helping other people, whether it's lost people come to the faith or it's believers who are just struggling with sin that's still a reality for them. We don't need to be the blind leading the blind, right? The helpers need to have a clear picture of this before they can help others.